End quote. Why exactly won't this universal bypass key open your vehicle, Mr. Miller? This is a direct violation of the Redwood Heights security mandates, and quite frankly, it's a security risk to every family on this block. End quote. That was the very first thing I heard at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning, a morning where the air was still crisp enough to see your breath, and I was just trying to enjoy the first steam rising off my black coffee. But instead, I stepped onto my porch to find a woman hunched over the driver's side door of my dark gray Ford F-150, jamming a jagged brass key into my lock with the kind of frantic, desperate energy you'd expect from someone trying to hotwire a getaway car in a heist movie. I just stood there for a second, the ceramic mug warming my palms, watching her pastel pink cardigan flutter in the breeze as she muttered to herself about compliance and community standards, and I realized right then that the end quote, quiet life end quote, I'd moved here for was officially dead. This woman, Linda Sterling, lived 4 houses down and had spent the last 18 months acting like the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. But today she had clearly decided that her jurisdiction extended past my lawn and right into my ignition. She spun toward me when she heard the screen door creak. Her face already flushed that blotchy, indignant red that usually signals a looming HR complaint, and she didn't oppose. To even say hello, she just pointed that key at me like a weapon and declared that all residents were required to provide the HOA board with emergency access credentials for, end quote, safety audits, end quote. I hadn't oppose to even finish my first sip of caffeine yet, so I just blinked at her, watching her try to force that hardware store key into the lock of a vehicle that was currently carrying about $10,000 worth of tactical gear and secure communication equipment belonging to the county sheriff's department. When her end quote, magic key end quote, inevitably failed again, she let out this dramatic theatrical gasp, whipped out her phone with the speed of an Old West gunslinger, and dialed 911 right in front of me, making aggressive eye contact the whole time while she told the dispatcher that a, end quote, non-compliant and hostile male, end quote, was obstructing a mandatory safety inspection and that she felt, end quote, physically threatened, end quote, by my presence on my own porch. What Linda didn't oppose, Tino, what she had somehow failed to process despite me living here for nearly 2 years, was that I wasn't oppose. Just some guy named Mr. Miller she could bully into submission. I was Sheriff Elias Thorne, and the, end quote, hostile male, end quote, she was reporting was currently the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the county. To understand how we got to this point, you have to realize that Redwood Heights was the kind of neighborhood where people cared way too much about the height of your fescue and the exact hex code of your front door paint, and Linda was the high priestess of that cult. When I first moved in, she didn't oppose. Bring a fruit basket or a, end quote, welcome, end quote. Matt, she marched up my driveway with a clipboard tucked under her arm like she was preparing to serve a subpoena and told me that my patrol cruiser, which was parked neatly in my driveway, was, end quote, visually aggressive, end quote, and might, end quote, trigger, end quote, the more sensitive residents who weren't and oppose, used to seeing, end quote, government machinery, end quote, in their sanctuary. I try to be the, end quote, good neighbor, end quote. At first, I really did, explaining politely that the cruiser was my office. It was legally parked on my private property, and it stayed there, so I could respond to emergencies in the middle of the night without driving to the station first. But Linda just bared her teeth in what I think was supposed to be a smile and made a sharp, jagged note on her clipboard. A week later, I found a formal, end quote, notice of aesthetic infringement, end quote, taped to my windshield with a $50 fine for, end quote, unauthorized display of paramilitary insignia, end quote, which was her fancy way of saying she hated the sheriff's star on the door. I didn't oppose. Pay it, obviously. I just started a folder in my study labeled, end quote, Linda's creative writing project, end quote, and went about my business, but Linda wasn't oppose. The type to let a grudge go cold. She was the type to feed it, water it, and let it grow into a full-scale obsession. She started finding me for the most absurd things like, end quote, excessive gravel displacement, end quote, after a rainstorm, or, end quote, light pollution, end quote, because the sun reflected off my chrome bumper into her prize hydrangeas. But the real war started when she proposed the, end quote, universal key initiative, end quote. She wanted every homeowner to hand over a master key to their house and car so the HOA could perform, end quote, wellness checks, end quote, and in quote, safety sweeps in quote, whenever they saw fit, and when I told her, in front of the whole neighborhood at the mailboxes, that there was a better chance of me flying to Mars and handing her the keys to my life, she just turned pale, whispered in quote, we'll see about that, in quote, and walked away with a stiffness in her shoulders that told me the gloves were off. So back to that Tuesday morning, the police sirens started wailing in the distance, and Linda's face transformed into this mask of pure, unadulterated triumph because she genuinely believed the cavalry was coming to put me in my place. A patrol car pulled into the cul-de-sac, tires crunching on the asphalt, and Deputy Sam Holloway stepped out, looking confused as hell because he'd been to my house for barbecues and knew exactly whose truck that was. Linda didn't oppose to even give him a chance to speak. She just rushed him, pointing at me and screaming about, in quote, obstruction, in quote, and in quote, safety violations, in quote, until Sam looked at her, then looked at me standing there in my slippers and a t-shirt, and just said, in quote, morning, Sheriff. Is there a reason this lady is trying to break into your truck? End quote. The silence that followed was so heavy you could have anchored a ship with it, and watching the color drain out of Linda's face was like watching a sunset in fast forward. Her brain was clearly buffering, trying to reconcile the, in quote, aggressive neighbor, in quote, she'd been harassing for months with the man who signed Sam's paychecks. She tried to stammer something about, in quote, jurisdictional oversight, in quote, and in quote, community bylaws, in quote, but Sam just shook his head, told her that filing a false police report was a crime, and watched as she scurried back to her house, muttering about how, in quote, the law doesn't in oppose to apply to the elite, end quote. But here's the thing about people like Linda. They don't in oppose to see a crushing defeat as a sign to stop. They see it as a challenge to get more creative with their insanity. And by Wednesday morning, the neighborhood looked like a pink glitter factory had exploded. There were flyers taped to every mailbox, every trash can, and even the stop signs titled, in quote, urgent, security breach alert, in quote, in giant, shimmering letters accusing my truck of being a, in quote, rogue element, in quote, and claiming that my refusal to participate in the key program was putting every child in Redwood Heights in mortal danger. My neighbor Dave, a guy who just wanted to mow his lawn in peace, knocked on my door later that day, looking absolutely exhausted, holding one of the flyers and asking if I'd seen the, in quote, new rules, in quote, Linda had posted on the community portal. She had created something called the, in quote, Bluff County Oversight Initiative, in quote, which was basically a fake organization she'd invented to bypass the actual HOA board because even they were starting to think she'd lost her marbles. She started sending me invoices for, in quote, visual intimidation fees, in quote, and in quote, driveway imbalance surcharges, in quote, and one morning I woke up to find 24 neon orange stakes driven into the soft dirt of my lawn, marking out a, in quote, proposed perimeter fence, in quote, that would effectively cage my truck in so I couldn't in oppose to pull out without her, in quote, clearance, in quote. I just took pictures of everything, documenting the trespassing, the harassment, and the absolute absurdity of it all. But the breaking point came on Friday when I walked outside to go to work and found a massive, industrial-grade yellow wool clamp locked onto my front tire. There was a laminated tag dangling from the lock that read, in quote, impounded, non-compliant asset, end quote, with a list of fees totaling nearly $500, and Linda was standing on her porch across the street, literally clapping her hands together like a delighted toddler. I didn't oppose to even yell, I didn't oppose to even look at her. I just called the station and asked for a forensic unit and a flatbed, because at this point, she wasn't oppose to just being a nuisance. She was tampering with a government vehicle and obstructing a law enforcement officer's ability to perform his duties. When the forensic team started dusting my truck for prints and Sam Holloway showed up with a warrant for her arrest, Linda finally lost it, screaming about, in quote, oppression, in quote, and in quote, community sovereignty, in quote, as she was led toward the patrol car in her orthopedic sandals. It turned out she'd been using HOA funds to buy those wool clamps and the, in quote, master keys, in quote, off some shady website, and she'd even set up a fake PayPal account to funnel, in quote, compliance fines, in quote, into her personal vacation fund so the, in quote, oversight initiative, in quote, was actually just a fancy name for wire fraud and embezzlement. We found binders in her house. Binders full of photos of everyone's trash cans, schedules of when neighbors left for work, and even in quote, aesthetic grades in quote, she'd given to the local kids and oppos, lemonade stands. The neighborhood finally breathed a collective sigh of relief when she sold her house to cover her legal fees and moved 3 towns over. But the kicker is that my friend in the record department called me a month ago and said a woman named Linda Sterling had just applied for a permit to start a, in quote, Neighborhood Vigilance Committee, in quote, in her new development. I guess some people are just born with a clipboard in their hand and a void where their common sense should be, but it makes you wonder, doesn't it, Oppos? It? How many people like Linda are out there right now, measuring the height of your grass and dreaming of the day they can lock your car wheels? Have you ever dealt with a, in quote, Karen, in quote, who thought she was the sheriff? Or maybe someone who actually tried to, in quote, fine, in quote, you for something as stupid as a shadow on your driveway? Drop your stories in the comments because I need to know I and Oppos. I'm not the only one who's had to fight for the right to park my own truck in my own damn driveway. And hey, if you want more stories about petty tyrants getting exactly what they deserve, hit that subscribe button. Stay safe, stay compliant, and for heaven and Oppos' sake, keep your keys to yourself.